Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome everyone coming in. We're going to take just a few seconds so that we can get everybody situated here and everybody's dropping into the rooms, and then we'll go ahead and get started here. We like to stay on time, so we'll probably go ahead and get started probably within about the next 30 seconds. All right, so I am going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our Pesticides and Your Patient's Clinical Considerations and Exposure Risk webinar. My name is Jamie Montgomery. I'm the project coordinator for Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center. We're a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital, and today I will be your host and moderator. So we're just going to go over a couple housekeeping items. On your GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to notice that all microphones are going to remain muted during this session. If you're experiencing any audio difficulties, please make sure that your computer speaker volume is turned up or use the phone option to listen in. You can download the slide deck in the handouts section. If you have trouble downloading the slides, please send me an email and I'd be more than happy to get those sent to you. Please use the questions option for typing any questions or comment at any time. However, we do want to make sure you know that questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. If we have run out of time, we will still answer your questions via email. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for reviews on our YouTube page, as well as visiting www.opahec.org/webinar-1 within 1 week. If you have any questions at all whatsoever, please email me at jmontgomer@semhealth.org, and those questions will be forwarded along to our presenters. Let's see here. Also make sure that once we are finished with the completion of this webinar, that you are going to go to eads.com. You're going to be obtaining your certificate of completion for your hours. Please make sure that you type in this activity code. You do need to make sure that you have this activity code entered within 1 week. Otherwise, it does expire. Again, this is going to be 32FEDS@eads.com. Also, I want to make sure that you know that the presenters and planners of this activity have no relevant financial relationships to disclose with ineligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to our presenters. We have Ms. Diana Sims as well as Meredith Cox for you today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and switch over roles here and let them take it away. One moment.
Great. Thank you, Jamie, so much. Just a quick check on the display here, if you're correctly seeing my slide set. Share my screen, there we go. Jamie, can you confirm for me that you're seeing the correct display of my slides?
Everything looks perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us back for the third time, Oregon Pacific AHEC, to do this webinar about pesticides for clinicians that are serving patients all across this region. So just a quick introduction about myself. I'm here to share information with you about a clinically relevant topic of pesticides, and more specifically disinfectants, or what are technically antimicrobial pesticides. And as Jamie was saying, I'm joined by a colleague of mine, Meredith Cox, who will be presenting on the second half, more narrowly on the topic of disinfectants. I'm Diana Sims, and I'm with the University of California, Davis, and I am the Pesticide Medical Education Director for PERC Med. which is, as you can see, spelled out here. It's a 5-year cooperative agreement funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency with UC Davis in collaboration also with Oregon State University. So our mission at PerkMed is to help healthcare providers prevent, recognize, and treat pesticide-related health conditions through the provision of education, resources, and technical assistance. I want to start, as I like to do with all presentations about pesticide, just to ground us in kind of the broadness of the term and what things fall under this category, because I was quite surprised when I started coming into this specific field and space about how many things truly are considered and regulated as pesticides. So this comes from FIFRA, the federal statute which regulates pesticide and control of that. Excuse me, that governs the registration, distribution, and sale of pesticides in the United States. So the technical definition that you see here is a pesticide is any substance that can be intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. So most people commonly think of in their minds about an aerial application of a plane flying over a big field of agricultural crops and then spraying that. But in addition to those specific things that we may have visual familiarity with, these are an example of what you see here of some really commonly used but really under-recognized products that are technically are pesticides. So these include, for example, the flea collar that you may be using on your dog or on your cat. And they also include disinfectant wipes, which we're also incredibly familiar with now, and which Meredith is going to really give us some detailed information later. They include cleaning products, bathroom mold removers, weed killers, and insect repellents, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this example. Antimicrobial pesticides are the focus that we're going to go into later today, and they're really essential public health tools. Pesticides in general help keep our food and our water supply safe and are important tools that we need. So this is a picture that I actually took myself of when I first started working in pesticides, and it was in a local pharmacy, and was quite surprised to see this sign hanging in a pharmacy above what will be looking like familiar products to all of you of what's included under this broad term that we were just going over. So just an example of once you enter into a greater awareness of what is included under the term pesticide, you'll probably start noticing things like this. So some of the challenges that healthcare providers and the healthcare system in general face about increasing awareness about what are the signs and symptoms of pesticide poisoning. Part of the challenge is that really that the pesticide isn't routinely included in healthcare provider education or training. The symptoms can be very typically non-specific and commonly attributed to other primary diagnoses that will come first to a provider's mind. And the training really, while there's a lot of great stuff out there, and I'm going to share some of the resources that we've developed and supported over the last few years, excuse me, providers don't typically receive detailed training on exposures and symptoms. And I'll provide some resources, and my colleagues will help me populating the chat with some links to further more in-depth resources. So this is the context of a knowledge base where there's some gaps because there's a lack of training specifically on this topic. One important thing to know is that a little bit over 60% of states in the US do require that pesticide is reported as a healthcare provider, as a hospital, as a lab even. It depends on your state of practice. We know that folks here today, I believe, are coming specifically from Oregon. So this is an example of an interactive map that we have on our PerkMed website. Rebecca, if you could please, excuse me, populate the chat with the link to this map so people can, at their leisure, click on it. I'm going to use the example of Oregon, for example. If you go and click on the state of Oregon, what you will see is that definitely Oregon is a mandatory reporting state, and physicians, hospitals, labs, and other healthcare professionals are supposed to report an exposure, whether it's a suspected or a confirmed illness or condition related to pesticides within the first 24 hours. So that might be potentially surprising to some of you who are participating today. And then once you click on the map that I was just showing you, you'll get this detailed information, including links to the reporting website, the phone number, and for additional information. So important to know that not every state has reporting requirements, but a little bit over 60% of them currently do, including where we are. What I wanted to share with you today, in addition to increasing knowledge about what's included under that rubric and that term of pesticide and the reporting requirements, are some examples of practical things that PerkMed has developed to help and assist healthcare providers with getting practical knowledge. So if by the end of our brief time together today, if you're interested in digging a little deeper, doing a deep dive into the topic of pesticide, we do support and collaborate with a couple of different organizations from across the country where we have free online continuing medical education. The one that you're looking at right now is from our, we developed the reporting module. This is from our colleagues in California at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, a bit of a mouthful there. But they have, and we co-developed a module about reporting in this existing CME course. Excuse me. And then in addition to that, the one that you're looking at right now, we supported in collaboration with the North Carolina Agromedicine Institute. And this is really a robust set of in-depth farm toxicology for primary care providers that focuses on pesticide poisoning, recognizing it and managing it. And this course has a total of 4.5 AMA PRA Category 1 units associated with it. And you can, if Rebecca and Anne-Marie help me with populating the chat or the link, if you have would like to learn more about this field specifically, this is a really great, very in-depth one. I think there are a total of a little bit about 4 modules that go in depth into the toxicology piece of this topic. Recognizing, of course, the value and the efficiency of shorter format educational pieces, we have recently developed a YouTube channel where we are talking about with specific pesticide subject matter experts in the field of pesticide and interviewing them. And so this is a link to our YouTube channel, and we'll continue to increase the offerings on that channel. Right now, this is just showing you some of the topics, so ranging from pediatric care considerations, a health educator perspective, and then talking about family medicine and bringing farmers and clinicians together to talk about pesticides, as well as how ubiquitous pesticides are. And so these are just a screenshot to show you some of the offerings that we have on our YouTube channel. So I will be a marketer now and say, if you're to please check out the PerkMed channel. Excuse me. So some additional resources that, in addition to the longer format, longer approach CME courses and the short soundbite YouTube style videos, we also have developed resources that focus on specific active ingredients or specific pesticide products. And this infographic that you see here is about paraquat poisoning. And that was developed in collaboration with clinicians on our team. And paraquat is one of the most widely used herbicides in the world. And this poster was shared at an occupational health medicine conference recently last fall. So that's some of the ways that we get out the information to providers to try to fill that gap that we talked about earlier. In addition to those, we have brief infographic style handouts and informational sheets, such as this one that was developed in collaboration with the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit that's run out of the University of Washington, and just to increase awareness about the signs and symptoms of excuse me, pesticide toxicity. Sorry, you can probably hear a little strain in my voice and have a bit of a cough, so I'm not at my finest in terms of voice right now. Nonetheless, in addition to the, we have population-specific resources that we share at conferences and with specialty physician and other allied health professional medical groups. So this is an example of a poster that we put together for the National Hispanic Medical Association, and the information was shared also at the American Public Health Association meeting, and looking at the disproportionate risk Hispanic populations bear when it comes to pesticide exposure. And these are all on our website. I'm sure that Rebecca is populating our information now, and they'll be linked on the slide set as well. Another example, our most recent edition of a population-specific resource, is looking at the impact of on tribal communities and what are some of the unique exposure pathways that tribal members may experience with respect to a pesticide exposure. So just raising awareness for those clinicians, some of you who may be in the audience who are serving tribal communities, to be aware of what some of the exposure pathways may be that are unique to them. And this is yet just another example relative to family medicine. We put these articles out in through a couple of different platforms. The American Academy of Family Physicians, we have a collaboration with them where we showcase these resources, and then also through a publication, through a online medical resource called Doximity that you may be familiar with. So this is an example of some of the work that's showcased there. Additionally, we have case studies that are based on real life case scenarios. Some of them came from recent experiences of our clinician champions looking at suspected herbicide exposure, and some come courtesy of the Pesticide Health Education, Medical Education Project that was led by Dr. Matt Kiefer. So some of these case studies come from their great work as well. And we've just updated them in terms of giving them a refresh and put them on the website, so you can look at from a very practical clinical standpoint about what might walk into your clinic or into your practice area that could be a pesticide exposure. We're coming to the end. This is essentially the most fantastic detailed resource available, the 6th edition of this book, which is called The Recognition and Management of Pesticide Poisoning, that's got very specific treatment recommendations and is essentially the pesticide poisoning Bible, so to speak. And it is available on our website for download. If we do have a few hard copies as well. If that's something that you would like to have as a desk reference, you can go ahead and email me, and my email will be at the end, and we can get you a hard copy of this. It's a great, very in-depth resource. And as promised, there is my email address. Best to send it to this perkmedsupport@ucdavis.edu, and be happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar after Meredith walks us through the next section of the presentation, which I will be driving the slides. Okay, Meredith, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Meredith, and I'm the project coordinator for the National Pesticide Information Center. And I'll talk a little bit about NPIC. Actually, Diana, you can go on to the next slide. But we refer to the National Pesticide Information Center as NPIC or NPIC.
Sorry, it's sticking, of course. There we go. Just a minute.
Is it frozen?
You know, it's really cold here in Oregon. Maybe the screen is reacting to that. It is frozen for some reason.
Just well, so what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about my organization and how we can be of benefit to clinicians, a little bit more about different types of antimicrobial pesticides, as well as some specific chemicals in those categories, a little bit about some health effects and precautions for use, and then go over a few less common antimicrobial topics.
Sorry, Meredith, I'm trying here.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, you can skip through that one too. There we go, not lagging anymore. Okay. So NPIC is also a cooperative agreement between the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and Oregon State University. And we provide objective science-based information about pesticides, and we operate a call center that serves the whole country, mostly the general public, but we do take calls from professionals, including clinicians and veterinarians and other related professional fields. And we also have an extensive website with lots of information about different pesticide topics. So the hotline and the website are the two ways we provide information to our audience. Next slide. And so we don't give medical treatments or medical testing information, but we can provide information that may be useful for clinicians about pesticides and health. So although we are not medically trained, what we do is we maintain a library, essentially a library on information about thousands of different pesticide active ingredients. So if someone had questions about what are the reported signs and symptoms in the literature, or things like the fate and metabolism of a chemical in the body, we could look that information up for you. Next slide. And you can just pull up all those infographics. We also have some infographics, and here's a smattering of our disinfectant safety infographics, which have been a hot topic over the past few years, including things like using bleach in childcare centers, effectively using disinfectants against COVID-19, and disinfectant wipes versus other wipes. And these are all available online as well. So Diana already talked about what are pesticides, but you can go to the next slide. There are obvious examples of pesticides, like insecticides, insect repellents, rat poisons, and fungicides, but also the not so obvious examples that sometimes people don't think of as pesticides. Diana, if you don't mind scrolling through the different bullet points here. Sorry. So the not so obvious examples, herbicides. There's a lot of people out there that don't think of a weed killer as an herbicide and really view it in a different category, and they might view the risk of it differently as a result. Other things include wood preservatives, which we can be exposed to by drilling or sanding or sawing or burning treated wood. And what we're going to talk about today, antimicrobials, which are the category that includes disinfectants, but kind of colloquially, we talk about them as disinfectants. So I don't want to get too far down into the weeds, but I'll talk about kind of the three different types of antimicrobial pesticides that are out there. Next slide. And so the first one, well, first of all, there's cleaning products. You can just scroll through all of these guys here. Cleaning products are not antimicrobial pesticides. Things that just say they're going to clean a surface or whiten or remove dirt, those are not actually killing germs. They're just cleaning things, but there's a lot of kind of misconceptions, and people often confuse things that are antimicrobials for cleaners, and as a result, they don't think they need to follow and read label instructions when they're using antimicrobials. The three types of antimicrobial pesticides are sanitizers, disinfectants, and sterilizers in increasing strength, sterilizers being the highest strength. And these all kill pathogens. So the pest they're targeting is a germ, a virus or bacteria, sometimes a fungal spore. And sanitizers are the weakest, then disinfectants, and then sterilizers. And with increasing strength, there's often increasing potency, which could mean increasing risk. So something that is a higher potency chemical that kills more germs may have a higher concentration of active ingredient, or it may have a harsher chemical. So that's something to keep in mind. But overall, these are all antimicrobials, and we will just refer to them moving forward as disinfectants. You can go to the next slide. One more distinction is the difference between antimicrobial or disinfectant things and antiseptic or like things like hand sanitizers. And this is a common confusion among the general public, probably not as much among clinicians, but you know, pesticides are for use on surfaces only. They're not for use on people. So even if they share an active ingredient with something that comes in a hand sanitizer, like alcohol, commonly used in both antimicrobial disinfectants and in hand sanitizers, for example, only one of them, the hand sanitizer, is for use on people. And the importance here is that even if they share common active ingredients, antimicrobials, disinfectants, they're not approved for use on the skin. And that means that they haven't been evaluated for their risk to people of getting that chemical on their skin. They've only been evaluated for their risk on surfaces. And the assumption is that users read and follow the label directions, which tells them to, probably tells them to avoid contact with skin. So the assumption is that there's not a whole lot of skin surface contact going on. But in reality, we've heard of people using things like disinfectant wipes as baby wipes and just putting them on the skin directly. So that's more exposure than is intended from that product. And when something is used incorrectly like that, the risk is unknown. So those are kind of the main distinctions there. You can go to the next slide. And so a few different active ingredients that you'll commonly encounter in antimicrobial products or disinfectants include hydrogen peroxide, peroxyacetic acid, bleach, also known as sodium hypochlorite, and alcohol. And then a group of chemicals called quaternary ammonium compounds are very commonly used in disinfectants. And that's more of an umbrella term for like a category of chemicals. So I took a photo of one that I found under our counter, and it's got a couple of those quats in them. I mean, they'll often be listed on the label as their specific chemical name, which often looks kind of like a long, complicated string of chemicals there. But those are quaternary ammonium compounds. Next slide. And misuse of disinfectants is common. The CDC found that 1 in 3 adults use disinfectants unsafely while trying to protect against COVID-19. And this wasn't just the general public. This, I imagine this includes professionals as well, because we certainly heard from a lot of people across the board with questions about disinfectant use. So for my organization, for NPIC, we did receive a lot of calls from the general public and from professionals about disinfectant risk and also about concerns from exposure. Luckily, most of the time when people had misused or been exposed to disinfectants, they didn't have any symptoms or only minor symptoms, but we definitely heard of concerning use patterns. For example, kids being instructed to use wipes every day at their desk at school, handling the wipes themselves, or disinfectants being fogged into the air in classrooms while kids were playing, people wanting to disinfect their own masks, their face masks, and things like that. And also people in occupational settings being instructed sometimes to use disinfectants, to overuse them, or use them in a way that leads to more exposure than should be happening based on the label. And sometimes that was a result of requirements from their job or from a state health agency. We talk to people from in different settings, such as restaurants, schools, and even casinos with these kind of concerns. So workers in healthcare, of course, are going to be at higher risk of exposure from disinfectants because these are going to be the most commonly used pesticides in that environment in medical settings, right? You might be effectively in medical settings, and many employees in medical settings may even be the ones applying the disinfectants to surfaces throughout the day. So that can lead to both acute and chronic exposure. Next slide. So some possible health effects from disinfectant active ingredients. Obviously, there's a number of active ingredients and they can have different health effects based on what they are more specifically. But the mechanism of action for many disinfectant active ingredients is that the chemical breaks down or disrupts the outer layer or membrane of a bacteria cell or a virus lipid layer. And when people are exposed to them, the health effects often relate to the chemicals being corrosive or irritating. So typically, what we see most typically is mild effects because a lot of homeowner products and products that are used in medical settings too, but a lot of products, especially homeowner products, are diluted. So meaning the active ingredient is only sometimes less than 1%, less than 0.1% even of that active ingredient, and the dose makes the poison. So obviously there is going to be a kind of diluted risk with the diluted products. But we still see things like eye irritation, skin irritation, and irritation to the respiratory tract pretty commonly from exposure to these types of chemicals. Next one. And so some more serious effects are more likely to occur from a concentrated product. And concentrates may be more common. I don't know what goes on in the workplaces you all are in and how that works. I've never worked in a medical setting myself, but I know that in occupational settings, concentrates may be more common. When something is there's someone responsible for diluting and mixing and using, a concentrate throughout the occupational setting. And so with that in mind, the concentrate often will have a much higher risk profile. Some can be toxic if swallowed, and concentrated chemicals often are more likely to cause things like skin burns, or even prolonged or permanent eye damage if they get into the eyes. And then as far as longer term effects, there has been a lot of correlation and association between occupational use of cleaning products, including things like bleach and quaternary ammonium compounds, and respiratory issues, including asthma. And in fact, there are a number of regulatory bodies that do consider bleach and quaternary ammonium compounds to be asthmagens, something that could trigger asthma. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're in a setting where these products are being used frequently. Next slide. Oh, and there's an example of a label warning statement from a product with a concentrated disinfectant chemical in it. So it says danger, and danger is the kind of the highest level of what they call a signal word. So when you see danger, you know that there is something that could potentially be quite harmful in the product, in the bottle you're looking at. And in this case, the concentrated chemical makes it corrosive. And if you were to get it into the eyes, it could cause irreversible eye damage. So that's definitely something, especially for whoever is mixing that concentrate before it becomes diluted, would want to know about. Next slide. And if you are interested in learning about the lower risk, or finding active ingredients for disinfectants that are lower risk but also still effective at controlling pathogens, because obviously that's important, The EPA has put out a list of what they call their Safer Choice program, and that includes safer disinfectants. And so here's a list. I won't read through them, but those are some of the active ingredients, or those are all of the active ingredients that are disinfectants that are on the EPA's safer chemical ingredient list. And these chemicals are screened. So the kind of criteria that EPA designed for them to be on this list includes that the chemicals are not carcinogens or reproductive or developmental toxins, that they are not persistent or bioaccumulative, that they are not systemic or internal organ toxicants, that they are not asthmagens or sensitizers, such as the skin or lungs, and that they're just not on any lists of chemicals of concern put out by agencies like the EPA or other authoritative bodies like that. And I put the URLs to find those lists, but I think also a Google search of EPA Safer Choice Program disinfectants would probably take you there as well if you wanted to learn more about those. Next slide. So now we'll move into a little bit of precautions about disinfectants, including disinfectant wipes. But first I wanted to mention contact time because it's related. So contact time is the amount of time when you're using a disinfectant that the surface must stay wet with the disinfectant for it to be effective. And the contact time varies from product to product, and it also varies from pathogen to pathogen. So one virus might need a 2-minute contact time of being visibly wet with the disinfectant to be sufficiently deactivated, whereas some other virus may only need 30 seconds. So it does change from time to time, and it's important to know that you're using the product effectively, obviously, and if you're using it ineffectively, then you're potentially introducing a risk without the benefit. So this information will be on the label, and that's what you're looking for, contact time. Next slide. So precautions for antimicrobials, you can just scroll down through all those to the bottom. The biggest precaution for any pesticide is going to be following the label. So the label is the law, and the label tells the user exactly how it must be used and what precautions to take. So the way the label works is they're going to list the places that you can use something. They're not going to list all the things you can't do with it, just the things you can do. And that includes surfaces, kind of general use patterns, types of locations, types of objects. And if you do something that's not on the label, like use it on your skin as a hand sanitizer, then we have unknown risks because it hasn't been evaluated for that use. The label is also going to list if personal protective equipment is required. And this may be, it's especially likely to be required, again, if something is concentrated. Goggles or gloves, certain types of gloves might be required to prevent getting in the eyes or on the skin. If protective gear is not required, you can still take those precautions anyway to further reduce any risk. Things like wearing gloves, especially if you're using something frequently. Things like wearing gloves, wearing a mask, especially if you're spraying droplets, could be helpful. I know masks are being used in healthcare settings anyway, so I guess that's redundant at this point. But and then another one would be ventilating areas afterwards, especially if the area has a strong chemical smell. Sometimes that could be an indication that inhalation is occurring. And then with all pesticides, avoid touching the wet surfaces until dry. The main way you're going to have a dermal exposure is by touching a wet surface. Once it's dry, that risk is going to go down quite a bit, and that does include antimicrobials. If you remember, they need to be wet in order to be killing germs, so also that risk to us is going to reduce once they've dried. And be careful with food contact surfaces. This is probably less of less relevance in a medical setting, but things like countertops or anywhere where food is going to be prepared, not all disinfectants can be used on those surfaces, so you'll need to check the label. And sometimes the label will say you can use it there, but you need to rinse with water afterwards to reduce that residue. Next slide. So disinfectant wipes have similar precautions. You need to keep them out of reach of children. And I bring that up because hearing about schools where they're just being used on the regular, we would say children includes anyone under the age of 18. They shouldn't be the ones applying these chemicals. And again, disinfectant wipes, although they're often confused as baby wipes or wet wipes, they include disinfectant chemicals, and they might not be for use on food contact surfaces. Especially if it's something that's being used a lot by you regularly, you may consider washing your hands after use to reduce that kind of dermal exposure and the potential for the skin irritation that could develop over time or potential sensitization. And then in regards to contact time, when you're using a disinfectant wipe, it can be hard to achieve the full contact time if the wipe dries while you're using it. You won't be able to keep that surface wet. So that's something to keep in mind and make sure that, you know, the dry wipe isn't going to be doing its job anymore. So that's kind of one downside to these disinfectant wipes. Next slide. And just a quick note on home remedies. This is something that kind of came up in earlier stages of the pandemic, people mixing their own disinfecting and cleaning chemicals. So you shouldn't ever mix cleaning products, but in general, NPIC doesn't really advise people do home remedies. And the reason for that is you don't have instructions on the product, how much to use it, what precautions to take, or any first aid instructions if someone were to be, you know, were to have an exposure. You can go to the next slide. And they're also not tested for effectiveness because, you know, especially in the context of using a disinfectant, you don't even know if it's going to be effective or not. And especially with cleaning chemicals, I'm sure you already know this, but a lot of those kind of commonly available over-the-counter cleaning and disinfectant ingredients like ammonia, hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, bleach, and even vinegar, when they're mixed, can cause these really highly toxic gases that can even be fatal if inhaled. So, you know, people trying to make their own DIY at home can be very inadvisable and even dangerous when it comes to these cleaning products. Next slide. Just have a few more points. And one thing that came up in the earlier days of COVID that's probably not happening so much anymore, but just in case, is people trying to disinfect their face masks. Masks aren't supposed to be disinfected. As far as I know, there aren't any products registered for that use, and if they are, they're very specific, and the general person probably doesn't have access to it. So for any patient or something that is trying to be extra cautious and disinfecting their masks at home, that's probably putting them at higher risks from the skin and, you know, inhalation exposure of putting that up over their nose and mouth and breathing it in. Similarly with food, disinfectants aren't supposed to be used on food, including bleach. And again, food contact surfaces themselves, not even the food, but your cutting boards and your kitchen counters may require rinse after use or may not be allowed on those surfaces at all. So, you know, sometimes trying to take health precautions on the one end can end up with creating more health risks on the other from a chemical exposure standpoint. Next slide. So just a couple of other related topics. The application method for disinfectants is often things like wipes, like we've talked about, or spray bottle. But things like foggers and misters and electrostatic sprayers have been employed because they are really good at distributing the chemical. As you can see, like a fogger just shooting out mist into the air. However, these methods, unless the label says it specifically, haven't been evaluated for safety or effectiveness by the EPA. Therefore, they might not be the best course of action. We don't know how they're going to work if it's not listed on the label. Next slide. And then finally, there's also things that are not chemicals, non-chemical methods of controlling microbes and pathogens on surfaces. And these are pesticide devices. So they're using physical methods rather than chemical methods. For example, air purifiers, like with a HEPA filter, ozone generators, or machines that make UV lights to irradiate and kill the pathogens that way. And a lot of these devices can be effective. I'm not here trying to say they're not effective or that they can't be used safely. However, be aware that they do fall into a bit of a regulatory loophole by the EPA. The EPA technically has regulatory oversight of them, but they don't require safety or efficacy data submitted to them for review. So no one in any agency is reviewing the effectiveness or safety of these products. So it's sort of something that's buyer beware, and users should make sure that they're doing their due diligence and getting products from a company they trust. And again, these are not your typical pesticide chemicals. They fall out of that kind of regulatory zone. So a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I do know they don't have the same level of oversight from EPA. Yeah, and with that, that's all I have on the topic. So here's some information about the National Pesticide Information Center. The number up top is our 800 number, so that's a phone hotline. So you or any patient you have could call us between the hours of 8 and noon Pacific time, Monday through Friday, and talk to a pesticide specialist to get science-based information about different pesticide chemicals, or contact us by email or on the website. So yeah, I guess we'll turn it back over to the hosts here to see if there's any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, you guys, for all that amazing information. That was absolutely fantastic and so informative. I am going to go ahead and take back over the controls here. One moment. If you have any questions right now, that would be a good time to go ahead and use your questions dashboard, and you can type out any questions that we can ask. We'll wait for just a few seconds for those to come in.
Can I ask Meredith to expand on something in the meantime,
course.
Jamie? Meredith, can you think of any examples from your time on the NPIC hotline of where a provider, a healthcare provider, has called in, just as an example to show what a great service is that clinicians can take advantage of by calling NPIC? Can you think of a practical example from a call that you've perhaps taken in your time at NPIC?
Let me think. I'm trying to think of a specific example. I don't know if I remember a specific scenario, but I know the category of call that we get is often like a patient, someone is working with a patient who has something persistent or longer term symptoms, and they want to either rule out if it has to do with maybe a pesticide exposure they've had, or maybe they've had an exposure and they're having these symptoms, and they're trying to find out if they are consistent with what is reported in the literature. We can look that information up. I think those are probably the most common examples. I can't remember an offhand specific example, but I know like clinicians that have been working with people that have had occupational exposure, professional applicators, or people that worked as in agriculture have called us before, and I've had those conversations to look up what are the symptoms that show up from this kind of chemical they were exposed to.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't have any questions that came through currently. So just moving along here. So again, we thank you so much for joining us today. Please make sure that you do complete the survey and make sure that you get that returned. That's also going to be at the eads.com website. We'll email you with the slides upon request, otherwise they are in the handout section. Again, recordings, usually I have those posted within the next 24 hours. If you do have any emailed questions that you'd like to send out, that's totally fine, and we'll make sure we get those forwarded to our presenters for some answers for you. Make sure that if you'd like to get your CME or CEU hours, that you do go to the eads.com website and enter that activity code. The activity code again right here is the 32 FEDS, and we want to make sure that you do that within 7 days. If it is past the 7 days and you do need to still obtain your certification, please make sure that you reach out to me directly. We'll make sure that you get that to you. With that being said, we hope you have an absolutely fantastic day, and thank you so much for joining us today. And to our presenters as well, thank you so much for taking your time to offer this presentation and CME for everyone. With that being said, you can go ahead and disconnect, and we hope you have an absolutely great day today.